I want to welcome you to the formal start of our research agenda. Earlier this morning, we had a didactic session with regards to research, the enthusiasm to write and writing it well. And so we are very pleased this afternoon that we will have the beginning of what promises to be a spectacular day and a half. We all know why we are here in research. We're here because we need to look at all our serious problems that we have in our country. And today, our theme addresses one of the major public health issues in the country, and that is overweight and obesity. We know that there is a major issue as to whether we should consider obesity as a disease or whether it's just a lifestyle condition. I think we accept that it's a matter of both. I think we accept that it is, when we look at the diseases that are related to, associated with obesity, and when we learn that 2 out of every 3 individuals in this country are overweight at least, and now at least a third of our children are falling behind, this is a very ominous sign as to what we can see coming ahead. And so, without further ado, I want to thank you for coming. I look forward to everyone as much as possible staying and being within time. And I can assure you it's going to be a wonderful day and a half. I'm so pleased to invite my colleague, consultant in charge of our postgraduate program and accident emergency, none other than Dr. Krista Wells, to come up and chair the sessions.
Good afternoon to all. We're very excited to have session 3. I am your moderator for this session. We're going to remind you that no eating in the hall. Our first speaker we have is Dr. Donald Simeon. He is a professor of biostatics and research at the Faculty of Medical Sciences, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine's, Trinidad and Tobago. He was a director of research, training, and policy development of the Caribbean Public Health Agency and director of the Caribbean Health Research Council. I've had the esteemed pleasure as a student to have met him in 1999, and he still has that very humble personality. He was educated at the University of the West Indies and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He is a chartered statistician, fellow of the Royal Statistician Society. He has an extensive research experience as evidenced by his many publications. He has over 80 publications, scientific papers, and peer review. I welcome now to the podium Dr. Donald Simeon.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Pleased to be in the Bahamas again. Thanks, of course, for the invitation by Dr. Roberts and the rest of the team that has planned this 11th annual research day. Of course, congratulations to the faculty here in the Bahamas for hosting 11 consecutive research days, and of course I've been hearing that it is getting even bigger and more successful, so that is really good news. Okay, I have no disclosures. This is the CME code. In terms of the presentation this afternoon, I was told I have 30 minutes, and the moderator, glad to see my former student doing so well. Congratulations to you as well. I'll define what we're talking about when we say obesity. What are the rates in children, the rates in adults in the Caribbean? What are the causes? Why do we have these high rates of obesity? I'll focus primarily though on diets and physical activity in the populations in the Caribbean? What are the consequences of obesity, and what are we doing about it? What are the various national and regional responses to the epidemic that we are facing of obesity? And I'll also raise some considerations in terms of the way forward. Obesity can be defined as a medical condition characterized by excessive deposits of fat in the body such that it impairs health. So it is excess fat. So of course, one way to measure obesity is to measure the amount of fat in the body. And there are different ways to do it. Calipers, you could use machines. There are a lot of technology now. You can go on a scale and get your percent body fat, which can be used. And the definition for obesity in terms of body fat is more than 25% in males and more than 32% in females. Having said that, though, we usually measure obesity in terms of people's weight. In the past, we used to look at the weight of an individual, an adult primarily, was compared with what was the ideal weight for height. In those days, we used to compare your person's weight for their body frame and their height with the Metropolitan Life tables. We don't do that anymore. We focus a lot on what is called the body mass index, BMI, which is more objective and correlates well with body fat percentage and the risk of disease and mortality. BMI is the weight in kilograms divided by the height squared in meters. A limitation of BMI, though, is that it doesn't distinguish between fat and muscle. So a high BMI could be found in somebody who is, for example, a bodybuilder. Another way of measuring obesity is waist circumference. Easy to measure and a good predictor of cardiovascular disease, cutoff points. If your waist is greater than 102 centimeters in males and 88 centimeters in females, you are said to be obese in terms of central obesity, central fat. BMI is classified using the following cutoff points. Overweight is defined as a BMI of 25 to 29.9, obese 30 to 40, and severely or morbidly obese over 40. In children, you compare their BMI with the reference values for their age and gender. And if the weight for height and, the weight for age and for gender is above one standard deviation, that child is said to be overweight. If it's more than 2 standard deviations above the median, that child is said to be obese. What's the prevalence? What we can say for sure is that obesity is a global problem and it is growing, not only in the Caribbean, but across the board. WHO had produced this table which showed a gradual increase and projected up to 2020 in terms of childhood obesity, children ages 0 to 5. So it's really a big and growing problem globally. In the Caribbean, we have had quite a few research studies conducted on obesity. I looked at the abstracts from the CHRC conference between 2012 and 2015, over that 4-year period. CHRC, the Caribbean Health Research Conference, and there were about 25 papers on obesity, primarily looking at prevalence and risk factors. So it is well studied in the Caribbean. I chose, though, not to use results from here, but to use the results of the WHO Global School Health Surveys, which were conducted in a number of Caribbean countries, and which, of course, have a standardized protocol. So I can actually compare the results between countries. Here we can see, in terms of the percent of children who are overweight or obese, in the Bahamas, for example, well, the blue or the gray column is males, and the yellow, orange is for girls. And the prevalence is almost 50% in girls based on this Global School Health Survey, and about over 40% in boys. Across the board in the Caribbean, the rates are between 30 to 40, except perhaps in Guyana, where it's a bit lower, around 20% in boys and girls. Looking at actual obesity as opposed to both overweight and obesity, the rates are slightly lower, but even so, again, looking at the Bahamas, which leads the Caribbean in this area, unfortunately, we have about 25% of girls being obese and about 18% of boys. This is obesity. Looking at adults, picture, of course, is very depressing. When we look at the prevalence, again, the males are in the gray, blue, and the females in the orange or yellow. And rates are generally very high, above 70%. This is percent of persons who are overweight or obese. In the Bahamas, the males are about 80% overweight and obese, similar to the females. In general, though, females tend to have higher rates than males. Perhaps the highest rate in this figure was in St. Kitts and Nevis, where there were over 80% females who were overweight or obese. So, serious situation in the region. Looking at obesity, BMI over 30, again, rates are very high, and if I focus on the Bahamas, almost 50% of women and men, not far behind at all, are obese. So this is quite a serious situation in terms of the rates of obesity in the region, and of course in the Bahamas, which is almost leading the way. So why are we seeing these rates of obesity? What are the causes of obesity? Obesity is really about energy balance. Is comparing your dietary intake with your expenditure primarily through physical activity. If the intake is more than the expected expenditure for an extended period of time, and if you have a susceptible genotype, which I think all of us seem to have, you would become obese in terms of you will gain weight, you put on a lot of body fat. Also, we have to focus on what we call the obesogenic environment, which promotes this imbalance between intake and expenditure. So the amount and the types of food that are accessible and available contributes to this obesogenic environment, as are the facilities that are available, which actually do minimize the ability of us to really conduct physical activities. So facilities that minimize or increase physical activities are also part of the obesogenic environment. Of course, there are also biological reasons for obesity. Some appetite regulatory mechanisms, for example, may lead to passive overconsumption, medical causes, and there is a theory of fetal programming that may lead to obesity. But of course, what we can change, what we can work on primarily is on addressing the obesogenic environment. Of course, I note Dr. Ragan here, who maybe have different thoughts about changing the biological causes of obesity in her research that she is doing over at Fox Chase, but I will focus on the obesogenic environment. Physical activity. I think it's clear that there is a distinct rural to urban shift in the populations throughout the Caribbean, and which means that there are fewer open spaces, etc. We lead a more sedentary lifestyle, perhaps too much TV, computers, etc. There are also decreased physical activity opportunities, of course, motorized transport, different amenities in your homes. If you have to mow your lawn, you jump on a little car and you mow your lawn. You don't even walk to mow your lawn anymore. In schools as well, there's a greater focus on academics and less on children playing and, of course, physical education classes. And also the issue of security. I know in some countries, persons would indicate that they would not walk because of security issues. So those are some of the reasons why we have this challenge regarding decreased levels of physical activity. But what actually is the case? I focus again on the Global School Health Survey. I'm looking at what percent of children were physically active, defined as at least 60 minutes of moderate physical activity per day. The figures were quite low. I mean, all children throughout the region, all countries, the average was lower than 40%. So few children actually are physically active. This survey was done in children aged 13 to 16. So that's the age range that we are talking about, secondary school children. And looking at the Bahamas, less than 20% of children are physically active. In girls, perhaps less than 10%. Of course, when I saw these figures, I wondered, because I know that Bahamas has a proud tradition in track and field, and the women, of course, are world beaters, but in general, activity levels are surprisingly low, to me at least. We also asked whether the students attended the physical education classes for 3 or more days the previous week. And again, very low figures, again, all more or less below 40%. In the Bahamas, again, less than 20%. So children are not physically active and they don't take part in the physical education classes in schools. Adults, this is the results of the STEPS, WHO STEPS survey, which is a standardized protocol, which is really designed by the WHO, and we can compare the figures across the islands. And physical activity, so this is percent with insufficient physical activity. And we can see that some countries, some groups, for example, women in the Bahamas, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago, more than 50% of them had insufficient physical activity. This is age 16 to, I believe, 60. That's the age range for this STEPS survey. Of course, the men's were slightly better, but still, there were pretty high rates. Most of the countries had, I guess, less than 40% of the men had insufficient physical activity. But it is a problem, of course. Dietary intakes, we know that there has been a shift in diets from indigenous staples, local fruits and vegetables and legumes, to more energy-dense diets based on more processed foods and beverages. There's also an increased intake of sugars and fats, likely due to the amount of processed foods and refined carbohydrates and salty high-fat snacks that we consume. There's also reduced level intake of fruits and vegetables and an increase in the consumption of fast food. We have to really focus on the critical role of advertising, which I will mention later on in the presentation. The Global School Health Survey looked at the percent of children who drank carbonated soft drinks at least once per day, and you can see the rates are very high. More than 50% in all countries except Jamaica consumed these carbonated soft drinks. Bahamas, we are talking about over 60%, almost 70% in females drinking carbonated soft drinks. What I suspect is the situation in Jamaica is that they drink what is called box juice, which is not carbonated, but of course it's just sugar and water, just like the carbonated soft drink. So Jamaica perhaps isn't doing as well as may appear in this slide. Adults' consumption of vegetables and fruits, of course, it is recommended that persons consume at least 5 servings combined of fruits and vegetables, and as we can see, more than 90% of the persons in most of the countries were not consuming adequate levels of fruits and vegetables. So our diets are not good at all. If we look at these as proxies for the overall dietary quality of our population. So what are the consequences of obesity? Research has shown that certain conditions are greatly increased, that is, have a relative risk of more than 3 with obesity, and these include diabetes, lower body disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia, insulin resistance, breathlessness, sleep apnea, and some are also moderately increased: coronary heart disease, osteoarthritis, gout, and slightly increased like cancers, etc. So there are a number of diseases which are strongly associated with obesity. I got a slide from PAHO, which looked at the rates of premature NCD mortality in the Americas, and is divided by sub-region. We in the English-speaking Caribbean would fall under the non-Latin Caribbean, which is the first column to the left. And as you can see, we have by far the highest rates of premature mortality, which is persons dying between ages 30 and 70. So in the Caribbean, we are doing much worse than the rest of the Americas in terms of premature mortality from NCDs. And as I said before, obesity is strongly associated with NCDs. What are some of the costs of obesity? There are some socioeconomic costs, for example, stigmatization for persons who are obese, resulting perhaps in low self-esteem, the direct medical costs, and indirect costs, loss of productivity due to absenteeism, presenteeism as well, disability, and premature mortality are some of the critical areas in terms of the cost of morbidity. I saw a very good Jamaican study which looked at the costs of NCD's burden, and which looked at as well the role of obesity in terms of the cost of managing the NCDs. The results were quite frightening. It was a study collaboration between, I think it was UTEC and UWI, and as I said, they included, which was good, a health economist to really analyze the cost data. Of course, we need to have a lot more research in this area. And what they found is that the cost to manage an NCD patient per capita was twice times the GDP per capita for the country. So it's something that cannot be sustained at all. And of course, obesity contributed more than 20% of that cost that they calculated. So obesity really is, again, something that cannot be sustained in the region because of the costs to manage it. And what have we been doing in the Caribbean about it? We did a survey back in 2013 to identify existing childhood obesity policies, programs, and other initiatives in various CARICOM countries to determine if the data on obesity are collected for preschool and school-age children. We actually surveyed various ministries of health, whether it's the chief medical officers, nutrition officers, etc. And we invited 21 countries to take part in the study. 19 responded, and 3 countries had childhood obesity policies that were actually being implemented by the Ministry of Health. 1 had a draft policy. 7 countries had current obesity programs being implemented by the Ministry of Health. 10 had programs that were run by non-government initiatives, and 12 routinely collected surveillance data, which is good because we can actually monitor the changes over time in obesity in children, especially if we have interventions, that can make a difference. What type of programs do they focus on? Health education, health awareness, and various campaigns were run in 7 countries. These were mainly quiz and fairs, and they actually, in some countries, actually had inputs into the curriculum to really address obesity. 2 of them addressed behavior change, diet and physical activities. In 10 cases, they actually were combined health education and behavior change. The school-based and community included vacation camps, various clinics, etc. But there were a number of challenges though. One is that the funding wasn't there for staffing and for follow-up. The duration of the program tended to be very short. 12 weeks really isn't sufficient to make an impact in terms of obesity prevention. The site studies, they were mainly small studies, and often they wanted to have parents as part of the intervention, but they had problems motivating parents to take part, and most of them really required a stronger evaluation component to see what were the impacts of the various interventions. At the regional level, there is the Port of Spain Declaration, which includes a list of actions that countries are mandated to implement or countries have agreed to implement. And what is the status? The Port of Spain Declaration was back in 2009, and 8 years and 6 years afterwards, no, 2007, and 8 years afterwards, what is the status? They found that, one of the indicators was multi-sector food and nutrition plan being implemented. It was done so in about 10 countries. It started in 6 more and wasn't started at all in 2. One of the indicators was trans fat-free food supply, and most countries didn't even start that. policy and standards promoting healthy eating in schools. 2 countries didn't start. Most of them were in progress. Trade agreements utilized to meet national food security and health goals. Most countries didn't do much there either. So in general, the response wasn't that great in terms of the dietary indicators as part of the Port of Spain Declaration. There are also indicators that address physical activity levels and mandatory physical education in all grades in schools, which is PE, in all grades in school. That was better in that there were about 10 countries that actually had it and about 4 more implementing it, but mandatory provision of physical activity in new housing developments, having facilities, that wasn't done much at all. Ongoing mass physical activity or new public physical activity spaces, that seemed to be doing well. And so in general, we had mixed results in terms of really achieving those goals that countries signed on to, which would indicate the commitment of the governments to really addressing the obesity challenge, obesity epidemic in the region. Looking at the Bahamas specifically, there were about 9 different indicators, and about, I think 5 were implemented, were in place, and 4 were not. So Bahamas is midway there in terms of addressing these mandates that were put in place to address obesity at the regional level. What are some of the considerations going forward? What is really, I mentioned that most countries, many countries actually have something in place, but the question is, what do they have in place and how effective can we expect those interventions to be? So what international research has indicated is that what is the most effective intervention for obesity is regulation of food ads. That has been shown by far to be the most cost-effective and the most effective in terms of making a difference in managing obesity. What is found is that most of these food ads are really focusing on foods that have undesirable nutrient content, and they also tend to target children. So that's particularly, so the ads often are pre-sugared breakfast cereals, soft drinks, confectionery, savory snacks, fast food. So that is what tends to be most of the food ads on the TV. And of course, there's a need to really regulate those. Product labeling, the example, and gifts. Chile is a good example. They have actually passed a law where on the box of cereal, they cannot have any cartoons, like Mickey Mouse or any little toys in the boxes. Those are outlawed. So those are ways to really try to manage, the intake, the sale of these sugary soft drinks. They also have tags on the different foods in the supermarkets. You can see which foods have been tagged to indicate that they are high fat or high sugar content. What is also interesting is that it was identified through research that voluntary regulation schemes are not very effective. The state has to really intervene. Do not depend on people to self-regulate in terms of food choices and foods that they actually consume. Fiscal measures are also an effective intervention. Taxes, for example, I know that in Barbados, there is a sugar tax where sodas and other sugary foods have to pay a 10% tax, to the government. That hasn't been evaluated as yet to see how effective it really is in terms of food intake, but that is the way forward. Of course, imports, the types of foods that we import, we have to look at in terms of perhaps taxing those that are more high in sugar and fat, whole issue of local foods and having incentives for agriculture are also part of the mix in terms of actually in terms of managing the obesity. School-based interventions are also known to be pretty effective for school-aged children. What is noted, though, is that mass media campaigns are the least effective in terms of addressing obesity. So it's more targeted as opposed to widespread mass media campaigns. Let's share an interesting and successful international model. It's called EPODE. It's a French term for Together Let's Prevent Obesity, which aims to reduce obesity through a societal process, including local environments, local settings, and norms. So it has to be addressed locally as part of a team. It comprises 4 pillars: a national coordinating team, a scientific advisory board, so it's based on evidence. Political commitment is critical, and of course, private funding. So the private sector must be involved in the process as well. They cannot be looking on from the outside. You have to engage them. And the main intervention steps are to first raise awareness that obesity is a problem. Then you train stakeholders to convey positive messages and creative solutions guided by research, behavior change theory, and the experience of local experts. So it's not arbitrary, it has to be based on some theory and based on research. You also have to implement actions in schools and in the towns using approved tools and methodologies, and assessing effectiveness using BMI and other outcome measures, as well as the level of stakeholder involvement. APOD has produced very sustainable reduction in obesity. I think 40% obesity over like a 20-year period, which is really tremendous given the lack of success we have had, for example, in the Caribbean. It started in France and spread to other countries in Europe and beyond. Can we really be looking at something like that for the Caribbean? I think there's a need for more local research, though, looking at best practices, most effective interventions, etc., that are relevant to us in the Caribbean. So in summary, there are higher rates of obesity and lower levels of physical activity in females, but in males were not far behind at all. And the rates of obesity, overweight was as high as 47% in schoolgirls, with 24% obese. The rates of overweight obesity in adults were over 80% in women in some countries, with over 50% of them being obese. As few as 10% of girls had adequate levels of physical activity, and 10% attend physical education classes regularly in some countries, and as many as 60% of women had inadequate physical activities. Our diets are poor. As many as 70% of school children consume carbonated drinks daily, and over 90% of adults did not consume the recommended 5 servings of fruits and vegetables daily. Some countries' level initiatives exist to address obesity, but there are many challenges. Limited progress has been made in implementing the various CARICOM mandates in the areas of diets and physical activity. So what's next? Situation is very urgent. I think we must take immediate action. It's critical that we do the research to guide the development and evaluation of interventions, including policies. We must start by addressing the obesogenic environment. Regulation of food marketing and fiscal measures must be implemented. We must also ensure that healthy food options and facilities for the safe conduct of physical activities are available and affordable, and it's critical to engage all partners: health, education, security, trade, finance, agriculture, the private sector, etc., coordinated though by Central Commission. So perhaps we're talking about a Caribbean version of the successful APOD model that is used in Europe. I had planned to end on a light note, but obesity is a heavy topic. So I would like to thank you for your kind attention. Yes, I know that in Jamaica, for example, we talk about being fluffy, being as something that you're not obese, but you are acceptable, but yes.
One of the, I can't remember the name of the retailer, but one of the retailers has decided to stop calling it plus size and call it fabulous.
Yes, that is what we need to really guard against. We cannot be accepting to something that is really not good for us.
Is there any healthy overweight persons? Is your genetic makeup and your skin color, etc., genes, actually affect your BMI, in terms of your BMI could be a little higher than those persons who are Caucasian race, which most of the BMI charts are based on? you.
Yes, your second question was related to the race and the BMI and talk about healthy overweight persons. Of course, overweight is a BMI greater than 25. As I said before, somebody could be a weightlifter, very healthy, but of course have a high BMI. Having said that, though, they are of course in the minority. Most of us are not bodybuilders, most of us are really overweight. The issue of increased risk is something that we have to consider. What has been found, though, is that weight cycling is more dangerous than if you maintain an overweight, not obese, an overweight body size. That is, persons who lose and gain weight time and time again have a higher risk of disease than persons who have and maintain perhaps a BMI between 25 and 30. So that is part of your answer in terms of the race. It's perhaps cultural more so than genetic, you know. Having said that, though, I myself have questioned whether or not those cutoff points that we use are relevant to black people. That is, do black people have higher risk for particular BMI that are acceptable internationally? You know, that is something that we have to perhaps do some more research in. But as far as I know, though, combined, there is increased risk for disease once your body mass index is above 25. But perhaps more research needs to be done.
Can I just add to that? A very important question in terms of, you know, limited resources always, and who are we going, and it's not easy to change body weight in individuals or populations, so who are we going to focus these efforts on? And the risk stratification would be the ideal way to do it. If we knew you're going to get diabetes in 2 years, that's the person we want to target. I was just actually in China a few days ago for a meeting they have the opposite situation where if your BMI is 23, they call you overweight to obese, because they tend to get their weight, you know, it's genetic, we don't really understand what's going on, but they gain weight around the belly, which often guys do more than women, but there's a lot of overlap. So they have different cut points, and black populations, it's probably a little bit in the opposite direction. So even though we may not like the way it looks, if you got a lot of lower body fat as a black woman in the Bahamas, less worry there than the guy who, you know, weighs less, his BMI is lower, but it's coming around the middle. So there are various ways you can risk stratify, including where the fat is distributed, which you covered nicely, as well as what the numbers are, what the family history is. You know, I worry about hypertension more in a family where they tell me even the skinny people in my family, you know, have high blood pressure than the ones where, you know, they gain 50 pounds and the blood pressure is creeping up. That's very fixable. Anyway, an important area to explore more.
Yes, just to add, high waist circumference is a very good predictor of metabolic disease like diabetes. So it really is something that we perhaps be paying more attention to, in addition to just the BMI and the, you know, overweight and obese. So that is a critical point. The issue of family association with obesity is something, of course, that we have to look into more closely. Is it genetic, or is it because the families eat similarly, that they have similar levels of exercise? So it's more behavioral association than genetic. But of course, there is a need for research there in terms of genetic basis, whether it's by race, etc., in terms of the predisposition to accumulating body fat, perhaps on similar diets.
We'll take a third question from Dr. Bloomfield.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I'd just like to bring attention to the fact that this program, Bahamas is becoming involved with the Health Care Coalition, is now on stream. The Health Bahamas Coalition that implementing some of these programs address with various issues on which obesity is one of them. Dr. Philip Swan leads the organization here, and the executive director for HCC will be here tomorrow. Maisha Hutton. But again, the question is this cultural, is this regional, is it genetic? I came to the Bahamas in 1981, and people worked this side. So genetic, it should have been there before, and I've been begging and pleading with everybody to help me to get it out. I've been tracking the data of these people in my office, and since January 1st, and now I've had only 7 women who weigh under 150 pounds in my office.
Yes, the problem is large and it is growing, and of course we have to take urgent action. The action has to be based on inputs from all sectors. I'm glad that the HCC is part of this, the scene in the Bahamas, because of course they have been doing excellent work, and of course we need to support the NGOs and all sectors. I mentioned earlier that the private sector, of course they are the ones who advertise, for example, these unhealthy foods. They have to be part of the mix, and they have to also contribute. I heard of a very interesting situation recently where a food company was given a prize in Jamaica. I think it's what's it called, this food, they serve fast food, but they have healthy options. Yes, yeah, but no, yes. Yes, but anyway, the point is that, you know, it is possible that companies doing very well and they have options that are healthy. So it can be done, and of course it's up to us now to really document those best practices and share them across the region to ensure that other companies can actually know that they won't be losing money if they actually focus on healthy food options.
We'd like to thank Dr. Simeon for his presentation. Our next keynote lecturer presenting on obesity in the elderly is Professor Denise Aldemeyer-Scher. She's a medical doctor and professor of public health and aging. She's the director of graduate studies and research at the University of the West Indies, where she has worked for more than 25 years. She has worked with her scientific research, examining the responses needed in Jamaica's primary healthcare system that deals specifically with Jamaica's aging population. And she was instrumental in the development of the national policy on aging, which has been in effect since 1998. I welcome now to the podium Professor Aldemeyer-Scher.
Thank you very much. Now you're going to, having heard me this morning, now you're going to see my research area, and if I admit it, my true passion. The good thing about coming after somebody is that a lot of what you're going to say has been covered. But I'm going to look at obesity in the elderly. I'm therefore looking at it in the over 60 population, a population that tends to get left out of most of the studies, and the over 70, the healthy lifestyle studies that we have in the region stop at 70. So there's not much information. Dr. Simeon did look at obesity. However, and this obviously we've just had this discussion, it's not as clear-cut as it is for younger persons. And the studies to date, which is the point that's just been made, have not only been done in younger populations, but they have been done in white populations. I was unable to find a study done on the 60 to 100 in any black population. I was unable to. I understand that the current Jamaican lifestyle survey is in fact, that I've made enough noise over the years, that it's in fact going to go to age 90. Until recently we had the oldest person in the world, so I'm not too sure why they stopped at 90. Life expectancy is increasing, and I think this is even more important for us to look at. We have in the Caribbean, and the Bahamas is no different, most of our populations are now 11 to 12%. If you go into Barbados, it's 15%. We're looking at median ages now of 30, and we are looking at the over 80 population being our fastest growing population. Our over 80 in Jamaica between our two surveys, which is 1990 and 2012, doubled. Our centenarians doubled. Therefore, we are going to have this group of older people, and this group of older people come with their own issues associated with the aging process, and they're going to get into it with obesity. The study that I was able to find is that a third of the US 60 and over have BMIs in excess of 30. And we do have our international speakers who may well contradict these figures and tell me now that it's higher. I actually think that in the Caribbean, certainly for Jamaica, and I'm sure for the Bahamas, since your obesity level is slightly higher than ours, it's probably 50%. So the debate persists for older people about the relationship of obesity in old age to the disease-specific mortality, and what is obesity in old age, or for older people. Because there's a slide coming up, and Dr. Simeon made mention of it. Remember that the measurement of the BMI is going to be somewhat challenging, especially in that over 80 population, because of the loss of muscle mass. So you're going to get this. What's the clinical relevance? As a lady said to me, it's not just about what you want. And I was giving her a lovely lecture about her diet, and she laughed at me. She said, "Doc, I'm 82. I've gone way past my 70. God has given me borrowed time. Now you allow me to enjoy it." What are you going to tell an 82-year-old, you know? By the way, she continued to enjoy it and then lived to 93. So I think the questions about whether there are differences, and as our international visitor mentioned, is it just some families? Because clearly she came from a family that was not going to have these issues. So these are things to think about. Dr. Simeon spoke about this as well, but again, I want you to think about it from the point of view of older people, because yes, there's a stable energy intake, and the decreased energy requirement is going to be particularly so for older people, and particularly so for some older people, especially those with arthritis, those with amputations due to diabetes, some of the problems associated with living longer with your risk factors. So whether you want to or not, you're going to have decreased energy requirements because you can't move to burn it off. Now, I think all of us who have studied and whatnot know that sitting still with nothing to do does tend to facilitate one's hands going to one's mouth. So if I have nothing else to do as an older person, then I'm going to eat. They will sit and tell you, but it's my next eating time. So you have to put that now into the perspective of older people. And perhaps most importantly are these shifts in the proportions of fat and lean body mass. We know that visceral fat increases, but we know there's decreases in subcutaneous fat. And even without weight gain, you have the accumulation of intra-abdominal fat and the increase in waist circumference. So is this where we should be looking for older people rather than simply the BMI? And then what influences obesity? Because some people, the obesity develops as they get older. Most of us have heard about that 10 pounds that comes after menopause, which seems then to be 10 pounds per decade and just keeps going on and on. What is causing this? Is it only the aging process? Is it the fact that we really are being a little deceiving to ourselves, and it's a lack of, we're actually decreasing movement, decreasing it as much. But there are the physiological changes of aging, there are the chronic diseases, there's the medications that have to be taken, the polypharmacy, and let us remember that for older people we can't deny the psychosocial changes, the loss of spouses, the retirement issues, all of which have you doing less and less activity, because for some people you don't even need to come out of the house. So it's important because obesity can in fact mask poor nutrition, and we do have some subclinical malnutrition in some of these older people, and the remember what I said about the shifting of fat, etc. So we have people with BMIs of 27, 28, overweight people that are having heart disease, anemia, and I'm going to touch on the frailty and the sarcopenia separately, but there's also the osteoporosis, etc. So we have to think not just obesity, but obesity in the broader frame of its nutrition, and we need to not only look at the actual BMI, but for some, if the BMI is changing, we're going to have to look at some of the other parameters, particularly the protein and the HB. However, having said that, let us not minimize or attempt to minimize that we do have issues of obesity for older adults. And I'm being very careful here to use the word obesity as opposed to overweight, especially for that. And for older people, there's a difference between morbidity and mortality, which further leads to the dilemma as to what do we do about it. But we know that it's linked to diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, cancer, and for older people, disability. Many of our older people that become immobile, it's not just that their knee and their hip is bad, it's that their knee and their hip can't move 200 pounds or 220 pounds. Because you equally have people with bad knees and bad hips that are 120, 130, and they can use their walker and cane and they can get around. They then become serious surgical risks, and they are the ones that are going to need more surgery by virtue of the risk factors. This 220-pound person that you're going to do surgery, and how are you going to mobilize them? So you're going to get into the whole issues of clots, etc. So the issue of disability added to that list of causes of morbidity and mortality is critical when considering the older population. Then we have to think of the comorbidities, and I've just mentioned some of these. Let us not forget the increasing dementia in older people, an area that we're beginning to have to look at, and some of the issues that goes with forgetting to eat. Unfortunately, some persons don't just forget how to eat, they forget that they have eaten. And you will actually see increasing obesity in a demented person because they say they haven't eaten, and they will get quite boisterous if they are denied food. So we have all of these other comorbidities that we have to think about when thinking about managing the person. But despite all of what I've just said, there's really a lot of controversy. And for every study that says you must do something about it, we can find a study that says be careful what you do. But there's still controversy about the net health impact of obesity and at what point do you intervene. So it's not really that there is a health impact, but at what point do you really start worrying about this health impact? At the later ages, there's a weakening of the body weight to mortality relationship. That has now been demonstrated. And the studies are, and please notice that I'm using mortality because it's not so for morbidity, which further complicates our decision making. And the studies that are available, and please stressing, they're in younger, older people and in Caucasian populations, do tell us that the BMIs that are in the obese range are when you begin to see that loss of life and the increased mortality. Some studies have actually, and I've American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, have actually suggested that overweight actually has a similar mortality to younger people and can be protective, as was mentioned, with the weight, etc. However, most of the studies are definitely quite certain that if you're over 30, and particularly if you're over 33, that there is definitely an increased mortality. Yes?
Can you take a question now?
Go ahead.
Are they effectively corrected for these mortality and morbidity analyses the fact that there's a survivor's effect? Like if you investigate 90-year-old cigarette smokers, you may find they're remarkably healthy. That's because their cohort has all died out already.
Well, the ones that I had looked at, they were looking at it and they were actually just doing those that had died and looking at the relationship there. But recognize that there were these other parameters that you had to take into consideration. And of course, as you say, there's the general survivorship of people that get to 80. They are the survivors. What was very interesting in the papers that I reviewed, there was actually also increased mortality when the BMI went too low. And the cutoff there was 23. In the earlier study that we did, the 89 study, we didn't do it in the 2012 study. We actually went on to do further analysis of anybody whose BMI was below 20. And we did actually in that study document anemia, hypoproteinemia, and a host of nutritional problems in that. So this is also done, another study waiting to be done. So how bad is obesity? While being overweight in midlife is definitely hazardous to survival, a BMI, once you get into the over 70 or 80, is not seen, so far has not been documented as contributing to mortality. It is going to contribute to morbidity. And as I think Don said it already, what's particularly important in this group is the yo-yo effect. You don't want it. It's better to stay at a BMI of 27 and be on an even keel rather than go 27, 24, 25 and go. And it's the yo-yo effect. And there are also studies on diabetes control which has the same things. So you begin to see that there are possible links. I'm not saying there's a link. I'm just saying that it's interesting that the same thing is noticed for something that is so affected by weight and the effect. So it's really about our patients and our family members staying on keel rather than these draconian diets. The other thing too is that the BMI does not capture significant body changes due to aging, and I've mentioned these already, which leads into the fact that for our older patients, quite often monitoring the waist circumference and waist to hip are the ones that can be give you more information about how to manage. If you see this increasing, then you know that you probably have to do some intervention. And we know that in the risk of cardiovascular disease. So obesity and morbidity is not the same. So, you know, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because here we are saying, well, it's okay if you're 27 or 28. But before you get into these 70 and 75 and you can ignore that, you're going to find that increased weight is going to have decreased mobility and decreased function, reserve capacity, functional capacity, and of course it's going to contribute to increased or lack of control, poor control of your diabetes and your hypertension. So it's another area for further research. But that functional capacity is particularly important to people looking after older people, the geriatricians, because most of us aim for maximum functional capacity. We really say we're not interested in getting you better. We're making sure that you stay functional, independent, able to do the things of life. And therefore, we're going to be concerned about weight, especially where it is interfering with functional capacity. And we've said that. So we have a special situation with older people because sarcopenia, which is the new buzzword, and we're all doing research on sarcopenia, and does it impact function? Does it impact quality of life? Professor Forrester does have a sarcopenia study going. Now, again, we're running... It's the new health concerns, and it's an excess weight along with reduced muscle mass. So there's weakness. It leads to frailty. So yes, I should probably have done this one first. So what you can have is these people that are quite chubby, fluffy, as Miss Kitty has introduced. She's fluffy, so we're fluffy. And so they actually, on walking into your office, actually don't appear to have an issue. And that's where you have to do some of the other studies. So it's the thing about sarcopenia is that you have to take a piece. If you're doing the sarcopenia studies, you have to take a piece of the muscle. Old people, I don't know about your old people, but the old people in Jamaica don't like bits and pieces of their flesh. Take note. And this study, because it's my cohort, and I have had to actually pull my people from it because Professor Forrester says, but your people are refusing to come back. They find that this cutting out of the piece of muscle to do the measurements, etc., and then putting them on the treadmill, etc., to see what they can do is a little bit too stressful. And you send them in there to take part in a study. They don't see themselves as having any issues and problems. And so the usual question that we get is, how is this helping us? They don't really buy into the fact that they're contributing to knowledge. So these are some of the issues we have to think about. So it's the new health concern. It's increased obesity along with these age-related changes. I guess for those of us that are practicing, the real importance of sarcopenia is frailty. But we have other ways to measure frailty in our practices, because we can look at grips, we can look at the get up and go and look at how they're balancing, etc. So we have ways to measure frailty, and I think this is what's important, that we be aware that we can have frailty even in somebody that looks apparently well. So we've done this. You see, most of the persons with sarcopenia can often have BMIs round about 27, 28, and some lower. So they're not just small, frail people. The thing is that persons who come into your office and are obviously losing weight, if we're honest with ourselves, are going to get worked up. Because if they're losing more than 10 pounds every couple of months, you're going to say something is drastically wrong, and you're going to work them up. I remember a gentleman I had who actually lost 50 pounds, probably over about a 6-month period. He was 82, but his son was a doctor who kept insisting that I needed to do something with him. And the man kept saying to me, "Denise, I'm still playing golf. There's nothing wrong with me." But his son needed to know why he had lost 50 pounds. And he couldn't just understand that this was muscle mass and that he was getting older. But the man was playing golf and walking the golf course. So it's about, when we're considering these patients, I think we need to balance our need to know and our need to investigate with the quality of life. So, what are we doing about management of obesity? Clearly, there are benefits to safe weight reduction, but more and more, because of issues around frailty, around issues, and I know somebody else is going to talk about weight reduction, so I'm going to go through this very quickly and come out of it so as not to preempt. But I did want to make the point that when we're talking to older people, and Don mentioned it, the issue of exercise does become very, very important, and resistance exercises here. And 2-pound weights, 3-pound weights, they're okay. They're better than no weights at all. And that we're just putting in cardiovascular programs, etc., is not going to combat the muscle mass loss. So we have to talk to our patients about that. You also, when planning these interventions, have to think of disabilities. We don't live in very disabled-friendly environments. You know, we tell people to walk, and we have a lot of uneven surfaces, potholes. Very few places in many of our Caribbean countries have rails. Now, any of you that have been through any form of surgery that requires you to have assistance will realize that one step, if you've just had a knee replacement, needs something for you to hold on to. And we have not got there yet. We've not recognized the importance. So there's no point sitting telling somebody about a nice exercise program who can't even get out of their chair without falling. And you have to take into consideration, when you're talking about disability, the geriatric giants, especially the tendency to falls. And it means doing a real comprehensive assessment of your patient, the osteoporosis, the dementia, the terminal illness. The other thing, you don't want to assume that it's that, and yet you have a terminal illness lurking around inside. For older people, there's actually a positive in that, and I have a slide, but I'll say it here since that. For the diseases that cause wasting, particularly the renal diseases and COPD, starting off with a little bit of extra can benefit them because they have the extra to lose that the wasting disease then takes away. But again, we're in now to careful diagnosis so that you're not ignoring. So most older patients, adults embarking on weight reduction, should benefit from some nutritional counseling. The dietary calorie reduction should be modest and therefore has to have the exercise training component. Calorie restriction alone should be avoided, and then it's also about monitoring so that you don't get this yo-yo effect. For older people, please remember that you have a number of other things that are going to come into play when you're doing nutritional counseling. There's the dental problems. Do the dentures fit? Can they chew? There's the vision problems. And I'll throw in, with the vision problems, people who live alone. People who live alone, it's much easier to go and grab a sugar bun, you know. People who live alone don't go and cook, because who are you cooking for? So it's much easier to just grab something, a piece of cake, and a piece of cake gives you the sugar high and you feel good and you're gone to your bed. People with vision problems also have problems with the stove. I'm sure it's the same in Bahamas, because it's the same across the Caribbean. These people, a lot of older people, have to have a cooked meal, and it has to be hot. And of course, then you have somebody with a vision problem, and then they don't know how to use a microwave, so they won't eat the food because it's not hot enough. But you really don't want to allow them to turn on the stove. And I'm spending time here because I want you to recognize that what I'm saying is that older people are people in their own right, and they come to the management of an issue such as a nutrition issue, whether obesity or underweight, with a lot of other issues that need to be taken into consideration. Difficulty shopping. You could have all the money in the world, but if you have heart failure or a bad knee, the shop all the way up there looks very far, you know, because you can't get there. So these are all issues that have to be taken into consideration. The nausea from some of the medications that they're on for other things, and of course transportation. One of the things that the aging of the population has come with, which the family planning people laud as a tremendous success, is of course that family size is now down to 2 children. But when people had 6 or 7, there was usually somebody that could help. When you only have 2 children, there's nobody that can help. And the other thing too is that technology has crept in, because the last study we did, the 2012 study in Jamaica, 50% had the grandchildren living abroad. But when we asked, are you in contact with family? They said yes, because they're in contact via the internet and the cell phone. So they're not there to help. So you have to think in terms of chewing problems, difficulty shopping, difficulty cooking, poor appetite, financial concerns, and it's all about expert help, trying to get them to speak to their doctor, which means that doctors need to understand old age, and not just the geriatricians, all family medicine, all of those going into primary care. 60% of your population in your practices are going to be over the age of 60 over the next 10 years. So whether you like old people or not, you're going to have to deal with them. Therefore, I would suggest that you become comfortable dealing with them. And so we get to this point of trying to decide between Mr. and Mrs. Spratt, and what are we going to do? Am I too frail? What is too frail? Am I too fat? What is too fat? Clearly more research, and am I just right? Right. And what is just right? And I think we're going to find that this is something, particularly in our populations, that more research is needed. Thank you.
Excellent presentation. We'll now invite questions. What I'd like for you to do is to come closer to the mic, because we do have an overflow room and they're unable to hear the questions.
It's a great talk, Professor. Just a question. Can you comment on the obesity paradox? You know, where they say that a little bit of overweight is helpful for people with chronic diseases.
Well, I have a mic here. That's and that's the difference between overweight and obesity. So for those that are somewhere in the BMI between 25 and 30, for those who have other problems such as the COPD, the renal, etc., they technically are falling into that overweight that's going to aggravate diabetes and hypertension. But there are some illnesses for which they having a little bit of extra is actually going to make life more comfortable. So that's the paradox. So which do you do? Which one are you going to? I go with managing the hypertension and the diabetes, I have to confess.
Thank you for a very informative talk. I just wondered though, did you find anything in your research between the bidirectional relationship between obesity and its comorbidities and the sleep disorders?
I didn't hear the last.
And the sleep disorders.
I didn't look for it. That's interesting, and the sleep apnea and everything. I didn't look for it.
There certainly is, yeah.
I didn't look for it, but yes. And older people do have problems with sleeping, that's for sure.
We have another question in the audience.
Thank you.
Okay, we'd like to thank Professor Eldemeyer Scher. Our next presenter is a family medicine resident, Dr. Sunita Belgrave, and she'll be presenting on attitudes and practices of adult patients with and without chronic diseases to complementary and alternative medicine and conventional medicine in Nassau, New Providence. We welcome to the podium Dr. Belgrave.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Belgrave, and on behalf of the group researchers, I present to you our research, the attitudes and practices of adult patients with and without chronic diseases to complementary alternative medicine and conventional medicine here in Nassau, New Providence. I have no disclosures, and you already have your code. So what exactly is complementary and alternative medicines? Well, it's actually a broad domain of healing resources that is not a part of our usual standard medical care. When we say standard medical care, we speak about those medicines or those practices that we here as health professionals partake in. When we speak about complementary medicines now, we're talking about things that are used along with that conventional medicines. So you have a patient with dialysis, for example, and you use vitamins in the management. When we speak of alternative medicines, we are speaking about treatments used instead of standard medical treatment. So you have a diabetic patient, you place them on metformin, say 500 milligrams twice a day, but they come back and tell you, Doc, I'm using Surgibush instead. That is alternative medicine. So CAM can actually be defined into 5 groups. And I'll just focus on some of the bigger ones. So there's mind and body medicine, so things like yoga. There is manipulative, like a massage we're going to need after this research day. And then there are things like energy therapies. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Reiki, but it's that same therapy that was used in Karate Kid when, the guy Miyagi would have healed Daniels. So he pushed energy from his body into the other body to heal. So that is Reiki therapy. Now, worldwide, as you can expect, the epidemiology is going to vary. China, for example, shows a 95% prevalence. Regionally, we have places like Jamaica showing a prevalence of 72%, and locally, there are currently no recorded studies. So socio-demographically, we speak about this white, middle-aged female who has chronic diseases. And globally, the attitudes are very positive. We speak about a person's wanting a more holistic balance. We speak about persons wanting a greater sense of control, and more importantly, more satisfaction. A survey was done in Canada, and it said that 58% of persons coming to you would actually tell you that they're using complementary medicines. But 90% of them will go to their alternative practitioners and tell them that you prescribe medications. Very interesting indeed. In 2002, 44% of our users had no chronic diseases. 41 to 60% had one chronic disease, and 55% had 2 or more chronic diseases. So the choice of CAM, as we said, varies significantly based on the country and their systems of belief. Jamaica, we spoke about, like to use herb and bush medicines. San Diego, as you see here, like to use chiropractic. Another study showed that 55% of our users thought somehow that conventional and complementary alternative medicines had some type of synergistic effect, so they worked better together. And as you can imagine, this has various health implications. Now, given that Research Day is focusing on obesity, I just want to guide your attention to ephedra, because ephedra is a weight loss pill that was marketed in the past. People were very excited about it to get into that nice size 2 figure, but then it turned out to have significant cardiovascular outcomes. So therefore, we had to ask some questions. Is CAM use here more prevalent? Is there any association with those persons who have chronic diseases and those persons who are actually using CAM? So we did an extensive literature search, used various keywords. A descriptive cross-sectional survey was done, and adult patients greater than 18 years with chronic illnesses in our communities were enrolled. A questionnaire was used, and it was based on the 2010 NHIS questionnaire, which is a robust study that looks at thousands of 10,000 Americans over time to validate persons who have complementary alternative medicine use. Cochrane formula showed that a minimal sample size of 95 was necessary to produce this data at 95% confidence, and SPSS statistics was employed. So we used a sample size of 336 with a mean age of 51. Females were 72%. Baptists were 33%. And it showed that persons were mostly educated. 56% had up to secondary school education. Of those who were educated, majority of them were female. 97% were Black, 91% were Bahamian, and as you can see, the distribution was across the various islands in terms of their island heritage. 61% of our participants had high blood pressure, and diabetes came in second. 93% of our respondents admitted to the use of CAM. And there was a seemingly bimodal distribution where 48% of these patients used bush and herbal medicines, and 40% used vitamins and minerals. 57% of persons were still unsure as to if CAM was more effective, and we'll get into that shortly. And the attitudes towards CAM was mostly positive. Persons thought it could prevent illness, they thought it could treat illness, and they thought it could promote health, where 39% of them thought it could prevent illness. The attitudes towards conventional medicines were also positive, and 71% thought that it could treat illness. In terms of health autonomy now, 59% of our patients wanted equal partnership, and 52% trusted their medical practitioners all the time. But what does all of this mean? A prevalence of CAM in Nassau of 93% means that when you see 10 of your patients, about 9 of them are going to be using CAM. And you can see from the worldwide statistics that it's quite comparable. We saw in the literature that white middle-aged female who had chronic diseases. But what we see in our population here is the Black middle-aged female who there is no difference in terms of their illnesses. The attitudes towards CAM, we said, is positive, and patients still have some level of uncertainty as if CAM is more effective. And maybe it's because you need to tease it out a little more. Eisenberg et al. Said that, persons who favored CAM were those persons who wanted to treat things like back pain, arthritis, and headaches. So there's still more research that can be done. The attitude towards conventional medicine was also positive. Persons had reasonable trust, and they preferred a deliberative patient-doctor relationship. And in Fernam et al., they believe that the alternative practitioners were actually more effective and competent. So, in terms of the Bahamas, we see that, yes, the choice varies per country, but Jamaica and Bahamas actually focus more on the bush and herbal medicines. So from the mere definition of CAM, you can see that there's going to be some overlap between modalities of CAM use and conventional medicines. And that is actually one of the hardest things to tease out in this study, because even with the international data, they were unable to do so in many of our studies that we saw. So our recommendations are this. With a 93% prevalence, we as health practitioners must not forget to ask. Every time you see a patient, yes, you want to know what medications they're on, but you also want to know, are they using any alternative medications? Can this have any health implications on your treating conditions? 57% of patients were still unsure. So it's important that our approach is looked at. We need to make sure we educate patients once we find out what they're using, and we need to make sure that they understand how using one bush with, say, warfarin can have certain implications. 0% of persons thought the doctor-only approach was their approach. So it shows us that the only approach necessary is the patient-centered approach. Persons no longer want to have a paternalistic doctor-patient relationship. They want to share in the management process. So in conclusion, despite a high proportion of persons using CAM, patients tended to trust their doctors, they held modest expectations about CAM, and wanted equal partnership in health autonomy. These are our references, and I thank you sincerely on behalf of our group.
Excellent presentation. We'll now have questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a very nice paper.
Thank you.
Do you know, vitamins and minerals are often commonly used, as you show, but they're also perhaps commonly recommended by the doctor or the healthcare provider. So do you know whether that 40-some% are taking a vitamin and mineral supplement because of a recommendation of a healthcare provider rather than their own decision making?
Thank you for your question. We did not actually look at if the vitamin or the mineral was recommended by the health practitioner, but what was interesting in the literature review was that countries such as Germany was actually saying now there's a move towards finding out if every modality of CAM has a negative effect, and those ones that actually have a positive effect, they were moving more towards prescribing it. So as you said, it's possible that some of these vitamins were actually prescribed as opposed to just on the patient's own accord.
Any other questions for Dr. Belgrave?
Thanks, Dr. Belgrave. When you had asked them what type of CAM they utilized, were all of those categories available to them? Because some of them I saw in the list of types of CAM. You had a bimodal distribution, you mentioned.
Yes, please.
On that one now, were all of the other categories actually available to them? I mean, to be able for them to be able to use if they wanted to. In other words, are they only using that bimodal distribution because that's what is available in their location? And so not everywhere has acupuncture. Not everywhere has chiropractor. If they were, it would be interesting to know if they were available, would they have used those things too? You follow me?
That is actually a very good point in terms of, was it that it wasn't as available so they didn't use it? Some of it has to do with culture. One thing that we thought would have been higher, honestly, was the traditional Chinese medicines, and that's because right here down on Bay Street, there is a big shop for Chinese medicines, but that actually didn't, you know, it wasn't statistically significant. For another one, for example, was the Reiki, and there was 0. But in our research, there wasn't much availability of Reiki available in the Bahamas. So looking at the availability and the prevalence is a good point. Some things are cultural. I was just speaking to some of my colleagues before coming here, and I was just like, you know, what type of alternative medicines do you think would be more prevalent, even without their knowing the statistics? And, you know, they first shouted out bush medicines, and they said, what types? And they said, you know, Surshi bush, noni, and moringa. And that is very true, because that is exactly what we found as well. So a lot of it has to do what is the cultural practices and what is the availability in a country.
That's a great study. Do you think it has anything to do with affordability or economics or finances? Because bush medicine is nothing. They could go in their yard and pick it out. They get it from their neighbors or whoever else.
That is an excellent question. When you look at finances, it plays a role in many of the decision making of patients. Some persons who may choose to use it instead of conventional medicines might be because of that same reason. They may not be able to afford the medications, they may not be on the drug formulary, or it is there, but then when they come to the pharmacy, it's not in, so now they have to buy it, and they may just go and use a different bush because, you know, mommy say that Surshi bush works for diabetes, for example. So it is an excellent question.
I just want to make a little comment on that, something I know about. In Jamaica, for example, a lot of the time they don't go and get the bush themselves. They go to what they call a bush doctor.
Yes.
All right? And sometimes he charges more than the conventional doctor. All right? That's a fact. So sometimes it's not just economic.
It isn't. Sometimes it's just perception.
Okay, so that's our final question for this presenter. I see a few hands going up. I would have to take one because I saw your hand first, Dr. Bloomfield. This will be the final question for this presenter.
Again, congratulations on a good presentation. The problem I face with some of these alternative medicine is they just get a label, and the contents or what's actually inside of it is never known to them, and they often bring them to ask you to try and figure out what's going on. So it's usually passed down by word of mouth. The fortunate thing is that it don't seem to last for too long. You know, they buying this one from the state for ease of payment at $19.99. It lasts about 3 to 6 months, and they're on to another product. So you never really know what the damage or benefit really is. So I don't know if you were able to figure that out in your study. What were some of the products that they were actually using?
Well, our study did not focus on the products or the ingredients, but during our literature search, we came across a very interesting paper. It was actually published in the NCBI. They looked at 39 adverse effects that came out of alternative medicines. And what was, even though we don't necessarily consider this an adverse effect, but what they looked at as the main one was the fact that persons who would use the alternative medicines, they would less likely to use their conventional medicines, and then the adverse effect is not directly from using CAM per se, but now from under treatment or proper treatment of a chronic condition. So that was a very interesting paper that we looked at. Thank you for your questions.
Our final speaker for this session is Ms. Camille Nairn. She's head of the Health Information Unit at the Ministry of Health, Nassau, Bahamas, and she'll be presenting on the Bahamas' Health Research System Assessment.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Camille Nairn, and I'm presenting on behalf of my colleague Nanika Brathwaite Clark in her absence, along with our collaborators, Dr. Frankson and Dr. Simeon. Okay, this is just an outline that I'm going to follow the introduction and the background to the project, along with the methods and some preliminary results and our conclusions and next steps. Okay, in 2016, a recommendation was made to conduct a Bahamas Health Research System Assessment. We knew that a lot of research is being done, but in terms of our stakeholders, all of the agencies involved, we didn't know about that. So this exercise was an attempt to learn what is going on in our community. This was also recommended by our Chief Medical Officer, and we began last year. So what is a Health Research System Assessment? It's an analysis of the governance and the stewardship, the financing. It has many aspects: knowledge generation, capacity building, knowledge translation, and the use of health research in a country. A working committee was formed, and our work began last May of 2016. This project fitted very well into the Ministry of Health's National Strategic Health Plan, and particularly Goal 3, which is the improved use of information for decision making. The strategy is to strengthen the national health research capacity and guide policies and interventions that improve health outcomes. Actions that are related to that goal is to establish a national health research repository, to increase our capacity to respond to new and emerging health situations. So if we know who the persons are that are doing research, then we'll know who to call upon for collaboration. Another related action is to strengthen the ethical review and approval process for clinical and health services research. One of the key expected outcomes is to improve the overall understanding of the health research system structure. And along with that, we have also the development and strengthening of partnerships, which are very important, and also to translate new knowledge into national health policy, just to make a difference in the way we do things. With regard to the methods, we had a series of committee meetings. We also developed a list of stakeholders, and we contacted those persons. But in terms of the instruments, we used core indicators and key descriptive variables from the World Health Organization's Health Research System Analysis Initiative. And this helped to form the questions that were used in the stakeholder questionnaire. We also adapted instruments that were used in CORED, and they were used for development of the stakeholder and mapping questionnaires. And CORED is the Council for Health Research and Development, and as well as the essential National Health Research Council of Trinidad and Tobago, where this exercise was also done sometime before. As I mentioned, we developed a list of stakeholder agencies and individuals who we were aware of, who were engaged in research, and we sent letters of invitation for them to participate. Those persons and agencies we contacted included the heads of various agencies and departments, researchers that were known to us, health research units and agencies, as well as educational institutions. I should also mention that we also undertook a snowball approach, as we did not know of all of the researchers who were active, and we asked for them to pass us names of others that they were aware of. So, given the time frame, which was limited, we took a phased approach. In the first instance, we went to the health sector, and then we went to the non-health sector afterwards. And so these are the agencies we invited to participate. Ministry of Health and its agencies, also medical teams from public hospitals, as well as the Department of Public Health, UE faculty, as well as persons here at the University of the Bahamas School of Nursing and allied health professions. We also sought to engage the participation from Doctors Hospital, the Bahamas Heart Center, PAHO, the Department of Statistics, Environmental Health, and the Ministry of Education. They were all invited to participate. We took a phased approach, and the first was to complete the mapping questionnaire, and that one consisted of a questionnaire that asked about basically the research structural environment here in our community, and that included legislation, policy, development, any plans for research, what the research priorities might be. And this was just one questionnaire that was completed by a group of 5 persons from the Ministry of Health, from the University of the West Indies, as well as the Public Hospitals Authority. And we just went through all of the questions, and where there was disagreement, we rehashed so that we could come to a single agreement on the questions. We also distributed a stakeholder questionnaire, both digitally by email. We also distributed hard copies over about a 2 or 3 week period from June to the first week in July. And we distributed a researcher questionnaire in the same manner over a longer period. The stakeholder questionnaire was for the heads of agencies, and then we had a researcher questionnaire for individuals like yourselves. So I'll just share with you some preliminary results from the researcher questionnaire in phase 1. So we distributed a total of 300 questionnaires, and this is what we got. We got, by mid-January of this year, only 73, with a response rate of 24%. We found that about 2 out of 3, about 67%, conducted research between the period 1995 and 2015. The persons who responded were between the ages of 26 and 75. Most of them were females. About half of them have a professional university-based degree, and most who are medical doctors. And most of them also have a postgraduate doctoral degree. For those persons who responded, most of their education included some kind of research component, and in terms of occupation, most of them also worked full-time. So here are the results of the research projects that have been conducted over the period 1995 to 2015. So you can see that over time, based on the information we received and collected, the research has been increasing from, in 1995, there were 2 reported, up to 34 in 2014 and 31 in 2015. So research has been increasing in the Bahamas. We can we can say. And in the questionnaire, we asked persons to tell us about the last 5 research projects that they have been involved with. Okay, when we looked at the areas of research, we found that most of the research conducted fell in the area of medical and clinical. So medical and clinical research was the most common area that we found. There were 68 persons, and followed by population and public health, and there were 42 persons, of 42 exercises were done in the area of population and public health. With regard to funding, which is a very important aspect of research, most did not receive funding. 63% said that they did not receive funding. And of the remaining researchers, 38% got funding for 1 project, and about 17%, less than 20%, got funding for five projects. We asked the views of persons about the research environment, and this is the percentage of those who strongly agreed or strongly agreed to the statements concerning the environment. So here we saw that most persons thought that only 47%, thought that the international funding environment was encouraging. Another 45% said that there's a clear national research agenda. So this shows that we have some more work to do. Only 41% thought that research is usually used to shape health policy. And just down at the bottom, we see that again, less than 20% thought that they had adequate workspace and facilities. That is to conduct research. Okay, this section here looks a little more favorable in that 72% either agreed or strongly agreed that they know where to go for help. And that's important because that's a very important aspect of the process. 65% said that they felt that they were adequately trained, and another 60% said that they agreed that there are opportunities to present and discuss findings. In terms of publishing, a little less thought that was true. Okay, so based on our findings, we see that the response rate was lower than expected. We thought it may not have been surprising, but our target population really, they're very busy people. So we had a challenge with the time factor, just getting persons to commit the time to participate. However, we can see that the production of research seems to have risen. It has been increasing over the period that we were looking at between 1995 and 2015. And as we saw, many areas of the research conducted that were reported tend to focus more on the medical clinical side as well as public health. But there might be a bias there because most of the persons who responded were medical doctors working in the public health system. We also saw that most of the research did not receive funding, so this could possibly impact the extent of research that is conducted if persons have to pay out of pocket for their work. It is encouraging that our respondents seem to know where to get help for research, and being satisfied with being adequately trained. and also knowing that there are many opportunities to present and share results like you're doing today. Now, persons who are least happy with transparency and environment of the funding process, along with workspace and facilities, those are just a few areas where they were not so happy with the environment. So we hope to do next a full report, because this was only one aspect involving the researcher questionnaire. We also have the mapping questionnaire, where we got our results based on the consensus of a group. And we also hope to, I should also mention the third aspect, which was an evaluation of the heads of institutions. The response really was not so good, so at least for the other two, we will mention those in the report. And we hope that the report will be used as a guide for the formation of a health research council for the Bahamas, because there are other agencies that are involved in research, so we feel that this would be a good mechanism by which we can get started with the process. And these are our committee of 3. Thank you very much.